Hello and welcome back to the Agius Hour. The world around us has gradually declined over an extended period of time now to reach a point where Western civilization itself hangs in the balance. The undermining of the tenets of Western society has occurred in numerous ways, all leading back to destructive ideologies. Christianity itself is labelled in a degenerative manner, while its opponents target young minds to shape them into foot soldiers to help further their own agendas in the hope of bringing about their vision of utopia. My name's Joel Agius, contributor for The Spectator Australia and host of the show you're watching right now. And to help me unpack the destabilisation of the West and the uprooting of its culture and values in favour of a more progressive, or should I say regressive one, I'm joined by writer and author of Cross and Culture, Can Jesus Save the West, Kurt Mahlburg. Kurt, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Joel. It's great to be with you. Thanks for the invitation.
No worries. So obviously I've invited you on today to just discuss some of the, to discuss Western civilization and to discuss sort of how Western civilization has sort of fallen apart in some sense because of its uprooting by certain people, certain groups of people who are trying to sort of destabilize it so that they can bring about their own, create a world that is led by their own ideology. So I was thinking we might start with just, if you want to give a quick sort of intros to who you are and what you do, and then we can go from there.
Fantastic. Sounds great. So yes, I'm the author of Cross and Culture. I host my own blog. I do a fair bit of other writing, first and foremost with the Daily Declaration. So that's the news site of a Christian organization called the Canberra Declaration. So most of my work is actually with the Canberra Declaration. And essentially what we are all about is the right to life, religious freedom, and marriage and family. And the Canberra Declaration began as an 850-word statement about the value of these, principal, basically bedrocks of Western civilization. And it was launched on the lawns of Parliament House in Canberra back in, I think it was 2010. I've been on board for about the last 3 years. And the Daily Declaration is where we publish, articles every day about essentially world issues and Australian issues that are relevant to those topics. And so I do a lot of writing for them. I also write at McCadenet. Like I said, I host my own blog. Occasionally, I contribute to The Spectator. So that's kind of generally what I do with my days. But I've also written several books, most of them for the Canberra Declaration, and of course, Cross and Culture being one that I wrote on my own recently. So that's where I sit.
Perfect. So do you want to just tell us a bit more about what Cross and Culture is about and sort of what the topics you get into in that book are?
Yeah, for sure. So I was sitting on the idea for this book for probably 3 or 4 years. And really, it's the coming together of a whole lot of thinking of mine over probably half a decade. And really, what I'm fascinated with is, first and foremost, the incredible ways in which Jesus and the teachings of Jesus have shaped and influenced Western civilization. I myself was shocked to realize just how influential the teachings of Jesus have been on the West. Because of the process of secularization, we've very much forgotten the influence and the Christian involvement in the founding of nations like Australia. But in doing a lot of reading and research and thinking about this, I realized just how powerful the ideas of Jesus were on shaping our democracy, our freedoms, our human rights, even the values of things like education, healthcare, compassion, even the Western concept of what a hero is. In many other cultures, a hero is someone who has military prowess, is very powerful and feared. But in the West, when we think of a hero, generally we think of someone more like Mother Teresa, someone who helps the homeless, someone who feeds the poor, that sort of image of a hero. And most Westerners would agree with that definition of a hero. And the reason they would is, when you boil it all down, is because of who Jesus is and the influence that he has had on our culture. And so the foundation of Western civilization cannot be explained apart from Jesus. So that's kind of like one aspect to Cross and Culture. But also then I look at the ways in which that we have, as the West, really started to depart from Christian belief. And the chapter I write on this, called Goodbye God, I rely very much on the thinking of Rod Dreher. I don't know if you've come across him before. He wrote The Benedict Option, and more recently, Live Not by Lies. And he, along with many others, I mean, he also draws on people like Charles Taylor, but essentially looking at the gradual decline in belief in the West. And I guess it can be very tempting to consider, certain people with certain agendas being the ones who are chipping away at this belief. And that might be the case to some extent, but there are actually very logical, I guess you could say almost rational reasons for why Westerners no longer believe in God for the most part. And so tracing the history, essentially what I do there is I trace the history of ideas that have brought us to the place we are now, which is very much a secular age where, everything's kind of disenchanted. We don't really see the spiritual or the supernatural anymore. And we tend to think just in very kind of bare bones secular ways. And so that's another part of the book. And then eventually what I get to is how can we return to a place where we actually have a strong philosophical foundation for Western culture, where we understand who we are, our identity, our value, the value of humans, and a strong foundation for human rights. As you'd appreciate, Joel, over the last 2-3 years, we've seen a major erosion of human rights through the COVID policies that have sort of been unrolled all around the world and in Australia in particular. And I think there's a lot of Westerners who've actually just lost sight of what human rights and what human freedoms are and what they're all about, what they're built on. And I'm convinced that unless we have a wholesale return to belief in God and objective reality, we'll only see these human rights and freedoms continue to deteriorate. And so the whole idea behind Cross and Culture is to point people back to Jesus and the fact that he's the foundation of our civilization.
It's fantastic. Honestly, it's great to see more books like this in the world. I mean, we need those sorts of ideas in the world to help bring back Western civilization to its roots, and to obviously Christianity is at the roots of Western civilization, and which I'm sure you'd agree with, and obviously the values and ideas of Christianity have always helped to bring about goodness in the world and create a society that is inherently better, and I guess shape people in such a way that there's a sense of community and helping each other, not just focusing on the individual, which is something that we might get to now. Is I think something that we're seeing now a lot of is sort of individualism as well. Like we see people that are they're more concerned with looking after themselves than looking after others. Although, I mean, in some sense, there's been that warped sense of, in the last 2 years, especially with COVID and everything, of, people saying, well, if you don't do this for everyone else, you're a bigot, or you're a bad person, or, and obviously it's what they want you to do, not what you should necessarily do. You've got to do things out of the goodness of your own heart, obviously. And which is something, that we learn from God and in the Bible as well. We learn that it's better to do things out of the goodness of our own heart than just do them for the sake of doing them in some sense. But do you think that sense of individualism has played a part, I guess, in sort of destabilizing Western civilization and, taking us away from, steering us away from God and away from Christianity?
Yeah, absolutely. Individualism is a very interesting, idea to track through time. There are, I think, in some ways, individualism has been maybe demonized more than it should have been or than it needs to be in recent years. Because if you think about individualism in a positive sense, and you also look at its roots in Jesus' teachings, he was very much about leaving the 99 to go after the one. He was very much about, you're not just born a Jew or born a Christian in the New Testament sense, and that's just who you are, that's your identity. He was interested in people coming to personal faith in him. So, John 3:16, the most famous verse in the Bible, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes will have eternal life. And that sense of whosoever believes, it's an individual decision. So the idea of individualism that we have picked up on in the West does have its roots in Jesus' teachings, and it's super important. Individualism is super important against this kind of notion of totalitarianism or collectivism, where from the top down, from some despot or tyrant, we're told what we have to do, and it's for the greater good, is what we're told. That's kind of what we've seen the last couple of years. And individualism is actually a really important bulwark against that ability for the masses to get deceived and to sort of be trampled by collective rights. So individualism actually has a really positive aspect to it that we can't lose sight of. But on the other hand, in Western culture, and particularly probably from the 1960s onwards, but you could trace it much further back than that too, we have taken individualism to some very unhealthy extremes. So, very much looking out for number one, this idea of personal peace and happiness and affluence at the cost of anything and everything. It's really sad to see. I've personally spent a lot of time in the non-Western world in Southeast Asia, and seeing the way that cultures there are sort of set up and the way that people interact is very different, very much more community-minded, and you don't see that same kind of selfishness and ambition and looking out for number one that you do in the West. So individualism is very positive, but it can be taken to very unhealthy extremes. And one of the ways, I sort of go into this a little bit in the book, but one of the ways in which that has played itself out over recent decades is that by becoming so individualistic, so concerned with our own desires and drives and addictions and passions and whatever, we've kind of lost our sense of identity and our sense of community. What that's leading to now is we're sort of coming up with, because we are cut off from our families, we're cut off from our communities because of that individualism, that hyper-individualism, we've actually started to create our own new tribes. And so now we've got this really kind of toxic tribalism that's entered into Western culture. And you see it in the LGBT movement, you see it in the far left and the far right, you see it in all sorts of different kind of enclaves of the political landscape, where because we don't, so many Westerners lack family, they lack community, they're finding it in these quite unhealthy places. And so, we've kind of, invented this new collectivism. And then on top of all of that, COVID kind of hit us out of left field the last couple of years. And now we're sort of being told that you've got to do this for the greater good, you've got to do that for the greater good, you've got to sacrifice your freedoms, you've got to give up your bodily autonomy, and all of this is for the greater good. And I think a lot of people have bought into that because they are lacking any sense of connection. We've sort of taken individualism to its extreme. People are now feeling so lonely and so disconnected that, they hear a talking head on TV say, you've got to give up all your rights for the greater good. And they go, oh, that's the one thing I've lacked, community. And sure, I'll get on board with that. So I just think, because we've really departed so far now from the teachings of Jesus, we've kind of gone off the map a bit. And I think that's why we've seen a lot of the battiness over the last couple of years in Western culture.
I think you're right. And I want to sort of pick up on a few of those points. So, I mean, obviously, you said about spending time in the non-Western world and seeing that community and people actually coming together and helping each other because, in some cases they need to. I mean, in a lot of third world countries, I think as well, people are very tight-knitted and they try and, I guess, it's all about, in some sense, it's all about survival as well. But I think, if people in our first world don't see that sort of sense of a tight-knit community, and they sort of, I guess, they don't understand that because they haven't seen that in action. And I think, maybe it would be good for people to sort of spend some time in those countries to see that sense of community and to sort of be able to bring that back to their own countries and, their own towns, their own cities, and to sort of integrate those into their lives. But also, as you said, over the last 2 years, with that sense of, people sort of, I guess, wanting to do what the media or the government tells them so that they can sort of, I guess, fit in a sense and be a part of a community because they've been so isolated as well. I think that sense of isolation has, I guess, in some sense, brought their isolation sort of makes you feel obviously makes you feel alone, and you want to be part of something else. You want to be with people. You want to be in a group. And as you said, that sense of tribalism. And I think, that even goes back to sort of, I mean, I've been reading lately a book which I'd recommend to everyone called How Christianity Saved the West and and must do so again. And I think, it goes back to sort of that history of before Christianity really took hold on the world. And I think we're seeing a lot of parallels between then and now, between like the pagan world of the early before early Christianity really became much more profound and sort of converted a lot of people into believing in God and having that community of faith. And now, we've sort of, I guess, gone back into, I think the world goes in that cycle as well. So, I mean, so do you think, I guess, that sense of community is needed in a sense to be able to restore the tenets of Western civilization, the values that make the world a better place?
Oh, absolutely. I would say that. And I guess in some ways, because I've grown up, I'd say I've grown up a Christian, but I came to faith personally when I was in my late teens, probably about 16 or 17. But I have always grown up around other Christians and in a church community. And so I've very much benefited from what that is like from week to week. I've always got sort of events on where there is community around me, and I'm not just talking about people my age, but there's people much older than me, kids, playing around as well, like around their parents' feet, and interactions with them, interactions with the elderly who are wise and have learnt so much, and then people my own age as well. And I guess in some ways, perhaps I've taken that for granted. I've really benefited from interacting with all different generations and having constant events, whether I even wanted to be there or not. I'm expected to be there, and so I've rubbed shoulders with so many different people and really benefited from that. And I think as a Christian, sometimes I can forget how much other people have really lacked that experience. And like I was saying earlier, this trend towards joining a group of people who are politically like-minded or see things the way you do, and you've got a common enemy. That's not always a bad thing, but when people don't have any identity outside of that, and that's their whole kind of life, and that's their whole meaning for living, unfortunately, that leads us to some pretty bad places, because then our culture is really only being held together by a whole bunch of butting heads. I think we need something a lot bigger than that to be able to hold on to. So community at that sort of local level where you're interacting with real humans, flesh and blood humans, is super important. The other thing that we lack, and I don't know how we can get this back apart from some kind of massive supernatural revival where God just comes and changes, everyone's hearts. But what we also lack is a common ground, a common understanding of reality. Just a really good example of this is, and this has been playing out over recent weeks, I'm sure you've been keeping a pace with it, but this question of what is a woman? Senator Alex Antic asked the head of the Department of Health, I think it was just yesterday or 2 days ago, he asked him, what is a woman? And there was a panel of 5 people, kind of the top medical minds in Australia. They could not answer the question, what is a woman? And in reality, they probably do know what the definition of a woman is, but they're afraid to say it. And so we've got, on the one hand, people who obviously, like you and I, would be very comfortable defining what a woman is: an adult human female who produces eggs and can have offspring. Like, that's a really simple definition. It's one we've accepted for thousands of years. But we've got sort of half our culture saying this, and then we've got half our culture saying, I don't know what a woman is. It's too complicated. A woman is whoever feels like they're a woman, which you can't kind of have a self-referential definition. That doesn't even work. But we can't even agree on something as simple as what a woman is. And so I guess the point I'm making is, this is just one example, but it's true across our culture, across multiple issues, is that we don't even have a map anymore that all Westerners can agree on. And the reason we don't is because we've abandoned Christ. And we've abandoned objectivity. We've abandoned the truth of Scripture. And not that I'm an advocate of trying to force anyone to kind of believe things they don't want to believe, but I think we've forgotten what we've forgotten. We don't realize what we've left behind, and what we so desperately need. And it is going to take some kind of an amazing miracle from God to bring us back there. But perhaps we're already starting to see evidence of that. I'm very encouraged that there are conservatives, libertarians, classical liberals who some of whom I very much disagree with on a whole lot of things, but who are starting to say, because of the stuff they're seeing happen in our culture, starting to go, you know what, even if I don't believe in the Bible, I understand why the Bible is so important for the West to cohere, for us to be able to get along and actually have a civilization that kind of works. So yeah, like, not that everyone's necessarily going to come to the same conclusion you and I have in terms of a faith perspective, but at least acknowledging that we need some common ground to be able to stand on for our civilization to continue.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I completely agree with that. And I mean, coming back to that, to what you said about, about the what is a woman debate, that's sort of, I guess, taken over the world now. And, I know the Daily Wire's Matt Walsh is producing a documentary on this where he's going around asking people that question. I mean, to a regular person, it's somewhat insane that we have to even ask that question in 2022. I mean, we should be, we should know what a woman is by now. But I know, it wasn't only here in Australia, but obviously the new Supreme Court justice nominee over in America couldn't even answer that question because I think the answer she gave was, I'm not a biologist. I mean, it doesn't take a biologist to define what a woman is. But I think going back to that sense of what you were saying about truth and about, and objectivity, I think these days there's a lot of, people that use the term, I guess, my truth. And that's been something that's been very evident in the last few years in particular, even around like the Me Too movement and the feminist movement and all that sort of stuff. It's all been my truth instead of the truth. And, it's all well and good to have your own truth, I guess, but that doesn't mean that is the truth. I mean, the truth is objective. It's not, necessarily subjective as they want to make it out to be. And so I think that, do you think that sort of abandonment of truth in some sense, that sort of steering away from what truth actually is taking us in a direction where is, contributing to that sense of taking us in a direction that undermines Western culture and also undermines Christianity, so that, that continues to bring about destabilization in the West?
Oh, certainly, yeah. I mean, there are a lot of terms we could discuss. Relativism. I'm sure your listeners would be fairly familiar with that term. The idea that truth is relative. You sort of did describe it in a way. I see things this way, you see things that way. No one's right, no one's wrong. Post-Modernism is another word that's often used to describe that kind of way of looking at the world. This idea that truth isn't really objective. It's basically the reader brings their truth to the text or to whatever the issue might be. And so these ideas have been very popular in philosophical circles for and academia for probably generations now, and that sort of slowly trickled down to Western culture. And so yeah, we're seeing sort of the results of that in our culture at large. Even Friedrich Nietzsche, and he was an atheist philosopher, very influential over people like Adolf Hitler. Tragically, those ideas came to fruit under the Nazis. But he talked about the death of God in a particular sort of poem or short story that he wrote. And he used a phrase. He said, if we essentially kill off belief in God and declare the death of God, it would be like unchaining the earth from its sun. And yeah, it was a very poetic way of describing what happens if you cut yourself off from the source of objective truth and objective reality. And he welcomed that. Like he was a bit of a kind of crazy guy, and he saw that as a good thing. He sort of thought, if the world goes a bit crazy, that's a good thing, because at least then we've cut God off and we don't have to think about that anymore. But he was, even though he had a different kind of perspective on it than you or I do, he was in some ways correct about that, and we have unchained the earth from its sun. So the fact that we're in 2022, you and I may have thought 20 or 30 years ago that in 2022 we'll have flying cars, but instead of flying cars, we've got a lack of ability to define the word woman. I mean, it's just crazy where we've come, and we're supposed to think of this as progress. So it's very interesting times we live in.
Well, I mean, they do call it, they try and call it a progressive culture, but I think, it's quite regressive in a sense. So I guess, going into that a bit further, do you think, that sort of played into that sense of, not being able to define what a woman is and all that sort of stuff, and the straying away from actual objective truth has led us to this point where people are now sort of self-identifying themselves, and despite biological truth and what actually defines them as a person, like if they're male or female, and this whole debate between about gender and identity and all that sort of stuff. Do you think that's sort of come from that that sense of abandonment of truth? And do you think that that's going to that can be sort of, I guess, that we can sort of progress from there to be able to return to sort of the normal sense of biology and scientific truth in a sense?
Yeah, well, it does feel as though once you've unchained the Earth from its sun, the Earth can only drift so far before, as a civilization or as a group of people, a society or whatever, we realize, okay, this has gone on long enough. Like, we need to actually get our sanity back again. And certainly, I think I don't know how many genders Facebook says there are these days. It seems to change every couple of weeks. 72, I think, is the last number I heard. But yeah, we can mock, but obviously there's a really serious aspect to that, where people who are sort of trying to find their identity in this particular gender or that particular gender, what it boils down to is that because we've unchained the Earth from its sun, because we've cut off any genuine connection to God. People can still say they believe in God, but at least the God of Scripture, the God who is there, the God who speaks, we've sort of removed him and stopped listening to him. And the results of that mean that people they lack identity. We don't know who we are. And yeah, it is, there's a lot of low hanging fruit to mock in the sort of, libs of TikTok view of the world. I don't know if you've seen that account on Twitter. You probably have. And it's both funny and very tragic at the same time. But what it's pointing out is something very serious, and that's that without God, we have no way of defining who we are or understanding what our identity is. But if God is real, that means, if the God of Scripture is real, that means that first chapter in Genesis is true, where it says God created mankind in his image, male and female, he created them. So there's two genders, and we're not meat puppets. We're not sort of evolved apes. We're not, just floating on some rock out in space and who knows what the future holds kind of thing. If Scripture is true, we are made in God's image. We're of immense value to him. We're loved by him. We've been redeemed by him because of Christ. God valued humankind so much that he became a man, that he came to earth. He walked among us. He died for us. He rose again. He conquered death. And by putting our faith in him, we can have a restored relationship with him. That's the Christian view of the world. And whether you live up to those standards, whether you struggle with them, whether you have doubts, at least it's a reality that we can hold on to and know who we are and understand the most basic things about ourselves, like what gender we are, but so much more than that, our value in God's eyes and our value in society and what we've got to give to the world around us. So, yeah, I mean, I really think that we cut ourselves off from God at great peril. But the truth, even if we run away from the truth, that doesn't mean the truth stops being real. We can always return to God because, his word stands forever, and what his word declares is absolutely true. And so we can return to him, and he'll always accept us with open arms.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's incredible. The faith is incredible in that way. And I mean, I think it really enhances our lives as well. It gives us something to be so grateful about. And, Christians are very happy people in that regard because they have that faith. And even in dark times like the last 2 years, I think you'd agree that having that faith has helped us to get through those dark periods in time and to help us to, I guess, navigate the world as it sort of goes down into this sort of abyss of darkness sometimes. But I think the other thing that I find interesting is sort of going into this sense of, I guess, obviously when we put God at the center of our world, it helps us to sort of, I guess, progress well and to be walking a good path, a path that, we can obviously we will make mistakes sometimes, but we can learn from those mistakes, and we can, learn from those errors and correct ourselves and continue to grow as people. But when you have this sense of placing humanity at the center of the world, and humanity at the center of life, I think instead of God, and replacing God with, sort of this worship of humanity. And, we see that in countries like, especially in communist countries as well, and countries like China, where, the government wants to be taking the role of God and taking the place of God, and having people worship the government in a sense. I mean, I think there was, I think last year they were saying that, that Xi Jinping had told people that they should take down their crucifixes and put up pictures of Mao and Xi and worship them instead. Do you think that sort of, I guess, sense of putting humanity at the center of our universe rather than God, that sort of, I guess, helps to, destabilize Western civilization, but also to I guess, bring people into this whole sense of government worship and doing whatever the government wants you to do, in a sense?
Yeah. I mean, 100%. Humanism is a really interesting one. Years ago, when I sort of first encountered the concept, I thought exclusively of humanism as being a negative thing, because it removes God from the center and puts humans at the center. Now, that does have some really serious negative consequences, but we shouldn't altogether decry humanism, because there are a lot of positive aspects to it. The main one being that it did emerge out of Christian belief. It emerged out of the Bible's teaching that man is made in the image of God, and we are, a little lower than the angels. We're this amazingly valued and precious and good part of God's creation, sort of the highest pinnacle of God's creation here on earth. And we shouldn't lose sight of that. Obviously, there's philosophies today that say that essentially humans are a virus, that the world is overpopulated, and the best thing that could happen is if we essentially went extinct, or certainly came close to it. Now, that's a really terrible and nihilistic outlook on life. Humanism is far better. And a lot of you and my allies today in a lot of what's going on, who might be atheists, they might be libertarians. Essentially, they're animated by humanist philosophy, and like I said, it has its negative consequences. But one of the positives is that humanism still has a lot of good things to say about humanity and about human society. So we shouldn't altogether discredit humanism or try to cast it aside. It's got a lot of positive things that it has to offer. But on the other hand, if you continue that mindset long enough, and you put humans at the center, and you neglect God, you forget him, and you push him out, the biggest thing, the most significant thing in our lives, especially in the modern world, that we interact with, is the state, the government. And especially in a time when, because of all sorts of other cultural forces, we're looking to the government to provide us with everything. The government shuts off the tap of the economy for 2 years, but then turns the tap on again with, welfare, and we'll help you with this, and we'll discount that. And and not only that, but we're very blessed to have universal healthcare in Australia. It's a great blessing. But one of the downsides to it is that, again, we're looking to the government for sort of all of our answers. And, now there are arguments about the government paying for all of our education, right up to the end of university. And soon, and other countries are talking about universal basic income. These are all sort of the tenets of socialism or democratic socialism. The further we go in that direction, the bigger government gets, the bigger role it plays in our lives, the more we're tempted to look to government in the same way that in past ages we would have looked to God. And so, yes, there's a major danger that we essentially replace God with the state. And really, that was the major mistake of communism, of any totalitarian empire that you can think of, or construct that you can think of last century particularly. The main mistake, the common denominator, is that they replaced God with government. And so it's a great danger. And even in dystopian novels, there's been a lot of talk recently about, of course, George Orwell's 1984 or Brave New World. There's a whole lot of other dystopian novels. And again, a common denominator in those, they're fiction, they're not fact, but a common denominator there is the state became God. And it's something that we absolutely must stay away from. The reason that Western countries have the freedoms that we do, America with its Declaration of Independence, its Bill of Rights, and similar protections in countries like Australia and the UK. the reason we have that is because the people who wrote those documents believed that the smaller the government is, the better. And self-government is the ideal type of government, and where there are checks and balances, restraints on power, and essentially the idea being that we try to limit the incursion of government in our lives as much as possible, so that we can be as free as possible to live in community, to care for each other, and to not have all this power and tyranny imposed on us from above. And the further we leave our Christian roots, again, the further we're drifting from those principles of democracy and freedom. So there's a lot at stake. It's not just about the individual and our own sense of identity and worth. It's about the kind of democracy that we live in, the kind of world that we live in, and what it's going to look like in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years.
I mean, we've seen that growing of government in the last few years in particular. I mean, it just gets bigger and bigger, and obviously the imposition on our lives gets worse and worse, to the point where, we're basically living under the thumb of the government completely, almost. And that smaller government when we bring government into sort of shrink it a little bit and, make it smaller, it gives us more freedom to do what we want to be doing within our lives and all that sort of stuff. And I guess, that comes back as well to that. I think there's been a lot of talk in some circles about, church and state and the separation of church and state. And, I mean, I was reading last night about this a bit, and how, originally church and state was, it was meant to be that the state would sort of stay out of the business of religion and of, moderating religion and all that sort of stuff, rather than keeping religion out of government. And, we see a lot of this whole argument now that we need to separate church and state because people don't like the fact that there's people of faith in government, and they're worried that they're going to create policies that are based around protecting their faith and around, imposing that on others, which is not true. I mean, they're not trying to impose their faith on others. They're just trying to sort of, and, their Christianity, their Christian values are good for guiding, policy, and for guiding good policy, rather than creating policy like we've seen over the last 2 years, which has been quite detrimental to human rights. And obviously Christianity puts human rights at the center of, it's one of the big values of Christianity, is that we have this central focus on human rights and enabling that sort of rights for people. So I guess, do you think that sort of church and state sort of argument, what do you make of all the church and state debate, and where should we be going from here in that sense?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think you summarized it quite well. I do share your view that when we talked about, towards the, early stages of democracy like Australia, when the church and state debate came up, or secularization, that sort of stuff came up, what was at stake was trying to protect the state from the incursion of government. So, basically carving out this space for the church, for believers of any denomination, to be able to practice their faith without the government telling them what they can or can't do, what they have to wear, or how much they have to pay, or, where they're going to practice their faith and exactly how they're going to do it. It's like, no, we don't need that regulated. Like, this is render to God the things that are God, and to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. Church and Christian life and spirituality, that is God's territory, and it's not the business of the state. So that was the original principle behind the separation of church and state. But in the modern times, we've sort of flipped that on its head. And so now people are saying, oh no, we need to actually protect the government from Christianity, the government from any sense of religion. We need to keep religion out of politics. We need to keep it out of the public square, out of the public schools, out of the universities. And that's the argument today, but it's bollocks. I mean, that's never been, that never was the purpose of the separation of church and state. That's been flipped on its head. And it's a very very contemporary secular reading of the situation. A really great author and speaker and thinker on this topic in Australia is Stephen Chivera. He's written some great stuff, and he's done some great talks on, this whole concept of the separation of church and state. But our understanding of it today, I think, is really flipped on its head, and we need to set that straight.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I've seen some of Stephen Chivera's stuff, and I'd highly recommend people go and check him out and have a look at that stuff, because it's quite interesting, and it's quite well put together.
If I can add one thing to that, Joel.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
The idea that Christianity needs to kind of stay in its box, and we need to guard the public square and politics from spirituality or from religion. Again, like, not only is it super like recent, that perspective, but it's also built on a false premise that says that basically secularism is neutral and Christianity is not neutral, it's biased. And like that's also not true, because it doesn't matter whether you're an atheist, doesn't matter whether you're a Christian, a Muslim, a Jew, or even agnostic, humanist, whatever. None of those beliefs are neutral. All of them have certain tenets of belief. All of them have certain outworkings in terms of policy and all that sort of thing. There is no way, there's no such thing as a neutral public square. The public square is always going to be a combination of the ideas of all the people that come to that public square. And so the idea that Christianity is biased, so keep it out, and only let non-biased, aka atheist or agnostic views take up the public square is just, it's a false premise altogether. One of the things I learned about Scott Morrison recently was, I read, now I need to remember the title of the book. It's by Greg Sheridan.
Yes.
It's just called Christians, his most recent book, Christians. And he did an interview with Scott Morrison. And, there's a lot of positive things you could say about Scott Morrison and his faith and that sort of thing. One of the things I was discouraged to read is that Scott Morrison basically said, I don't let my faith, inform my policy. That's essentially, how he articulated it to Greg Sheridan. And I mean, I guess he's trying to say that because he's aware of the sort of criticism that would say, oh, don't impose your Christianity on us. You're supposed to be just a prime minister of a secular country. Like, it's not right for you to impose your Christian beliefs on your policy. But the reality, like, again, I think what Scott Morrison has expressed there is that false notion that Christianity is biased and anything that's not faith related is neutral, is not biased. And that's just not true. I mean, whether he's in power or whether an atheist, we had an atheist prime minister in Julia Gillard about a decade ago. She brought policies to her prime ministership that were based on her atheism. So if she wasn't afraid to do that, why should Scott Morrison be afraid to do, let his Christian faith shape his policies? So I just think that whole idea of neutrality versus bias, we've also kind of got that wrong. We need to reset the playing field and realize that everyone's biased. Everyone comes at these issues with preloaded philosophical beliefs. And that's fine. That's the beauty of the West, is the public square ideally is a place we can kind of discuss those ideas and wrestle with them. But the idea that certain ones should be excluded, I think, is quite frankly, it's ridiculous.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I was going to mention that briefly as well, that, when you mentioned that about, this whole idea that, people say that Christianity is biased and that therefore those who lead with Christianity at their core are biased to that religion. I mean, what you said is so true. I mean, you can have an atheist in power and they're still going to be biased. They're still going to, push through policies that are in line with their worldview rather than a Christian worldview. And so, you're going to get bias either way. People have their own ideas. They have their own beliefs. And obviously they're going to try and they want to, I guess, bring those beliefs into wider society if they can, and help others, and I guess influence others in some sense. Although with Christians, they're not trying to push their worldview onto people. They're necessarily just trying to encourage people to sort of think about it and consider it. And I guess and it's the same with other religions as well, and with other worldviews. There's people of all kinds who, they don't necessarily push their views on people, but they encourage them to consider them. And that is, as you said, that's the beauty of the marketplace of ideas and the arena of debate around those ideas, is that we get to sort of consider all sides of an argument and sort of figure out what the best way forward is. So, I mean, I guess going back to sort of the abandonment of Christianity, like, the demonization of Christianity by certain people, and, calling Christians, bigots or homophobes or transphobes. I think, you've probably experienced that yourself. I know that I've personally experienced that, in my time on social media, as Twitter in particular. There's a lot of people out there who aren't very much, there's a fair few that don't very much like what I say. But going back to that, I guess, do you think that sort of abandonment of or that, demonization of Christianity brings about a sort of a culture that is more devoid of morality, in a sense, like, that creates sort of things like, it pushes things like, say, abortion and I guess gender bending and all that, and I guess targeting kids in particular. I mean, we're seeing a lot of this now coming out, especially in the US, about, teachers who are trying to push their sort of sexual identity onto kids and to teach kids about those sorts of things at a very early age, or even as young as kindergarten. And obviously, Ron DeSantis got very much chastised for that by Hollywood and by certain people in politics for even coming up with a bill that just sort of outlaws that teaching from just grades K to 3. I mean, do you think that's sort of what's that's sort of creating that culture of that's devoid of morality?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's one of the interesting things with it's hard to land on labels, but let's just call it progressivism for now. One of the interesting things with progressivism, so-called, is that it's progressing, and that's kind of the mindset of the people driving this movement. But no one really knows where it's progressing, but it's doing so at 1,000,000 miles an hour. And this is one of the dangers of cutting ourselves off from the past. I mean, if those two terms, progressivism and conservatism, are often used to kind of depict the two, sides of the culture war, or politics in general. And conservatism, the idea there is that we're conserving the best parts of the past. That doesn't mean we're going to try to live in the past and only think of past values. But as we work towards the future, we're building on the best that the past has to offer. That's kind of what I see as the best definition of conservatism. And progressivism is this idea that, well, we don't really need to be guided so much by the principles of the past. We just need progress, whatever that looks like, whatever it seems like, whatever it feels like in the moment. And so, the people who are pushing this, who are pushing the opposition to the bill that DeSantis put forward, they would see it as progress, that these young children get to learn about queer theory and gender bending and discover a brand new gender and don't fit the normal kind of male female gender norms. They would see that as progress because we've never done this before, but it feels exciting and it's great. And so to give them the benefit of the doubt, I don't necessarily think that everyone who's pushing that is a groomer or anything like that.
For sure.
But I think there's very much a mindset that we're progressing and we're doing it 1,000,000 miles an hour, but we've got no idea where we're progressing to. And that's, I mean, you look at the history of, again, looking at communism. That was, I think, a very similar mindset. We're throwing off everything of the past. I mean, communism was always about cutting off traditions and getting rid of everything that we knew and progressing towards some new political reality, a utopia. We don't actually know what that's going to look like. We don't really know where we're going, but we're doing it at 1,000,000 miles an hour. And oh, whoops, we just killed 150 million people. I mean, that's the legacy of communism last century. And not to equate, everyone who's supporting this kind of crazy gender stuff with communists. They're not all communists, but there are similar warnings that should be taken note of. That if you don't have anything, any moral grounding, and you don't know where you're going, but you're going there at 1,000,000 miles an hour, maybe you should stop and think about what you're doing. I guess I've repeated this idea several times, but when we cut ourselves off from God, we don't really realize what we're cutting ourselves off from. And like Nietzsche said, we're unchaining the earth from its sun, and exactly how far we're going to drift and how perilous that ends up being. I think there's a lot of people that haven't even really thought about the consequences. But if you slow down and you look around enough, you can very much see what those consequences are. There are, just Google, or don't use Google, use some other search engine, but search for trans regret or detransitioners. There are, probably hundreds, maybe thousands of stories of people now who grew up, confused about their gender. They had hormone treatment, they had surgery, top surgery, bottom surgery, they call it. And now they are essentially castrated. They can't have kids. Their bodies are mutilated. They regret what they did. They want to be the gender they were born as again. But so much has happened that, like in their mind, they can sort of regain their sanity, but there's so much that's happened to their body that they can't really regain what was lost. And it's incredibly tragic. And that's just one aspect, but you could look at, a whole lot of different issues that are going on in our society. But there is so much damage to be done. And so it's desperately important that we slow down, we think about what the consequences are. And again, as a believer in Jesus, all I can say is the best place to look for morality, and really the only place to look for morality, is in the scriptures, in God's heart. And essentially the Bible is God's handbook for living. And people might think of it as being old and dusty and irrelevant and whatever, but the values, the principles that are in there have stood the test of time and remain so relevant today. So we cut ourselves off from the past and from God at our peril.
Oh yeah, I mean I totally agree with that. I mean, and even now, I mean, seeing kids as well, especially kids. I mean, it's really, really sad to see children being targeted by this sort of mindset, especially because they're so malleable when they're so young. Like their minds are so malleable, and they'll sort of do what their parents want them to do, or do what their teachers tell them. They're very subjective to authority in that sense. And I guess seeing, especially, what you were saying about how there's a lot of, you can see these stories of trans regret. I mean, I watched one the other day that, the Daily Wire's Michael Knowles, he did an interview with somebody who had transitioned and then transitioned back because they were quite regretful of their decision. And, while that it takes a very huge mental toll on these people as well, which is very, I think, some people don't understand how massive that toll is on people's mental health in particular. And, you see a lot of, I think, there's studies that have shown that there's a lot of people who are a lot more risk of suicide with people who are in that state of mind. And so, I mean, the fact that, decades ago, we wouldn't have seen this. We would have seen, people would have, if, a kid said, if a kid dressed up in if a boy dressed up in a skirt or something just for fun, or, was playing with some dolls or something, the parents would have just, let them have their fun and not been like, oh, my kid's a girl, not a boy. And so we need to transition him. Or, if I think there's a conservative commentator that I saw on Twitter a few years back, Ashley St. Clair, whose pinned tweet was, when we were young, my brother used to eat grass, but my mother didn't call him a cow, didn't tell him he was a cow. She said to cut it out and stop eating the grass and just, be a normal child. Anyway, but
another good quip I've heard. Another good quip I've heard is you might have seen this one. If your cat is a vegan, you know who's making the decisions.
Oh, for sure. I mean, that's the poor pet in that sense, honestly.
Yeah.
Anyway, but so I guess going into sort of, solutions for this sort of realm in particular, and how we can, bring Western civilization back to its roots, back to its Christian roots and its values of, of freedom of conscience, of making our own decisions in that sense, of respecting human life and the sanctity of human life, and of seeing all human life created as equal, not just, some are better than others just because of their social status or their wealth, or, something in particular, or the level of power they have. How do you think we can, as Christians, how we can sort of bring back Christianity, the roots of Christianity, of the West in Christianity, back to Western civilization?
Yeah, that's a huge question, bottomless in some ways. I'm a big believer in just the church being the church. I grew up in the Lutheran church. I've been in Baptist churches. I'm in a Pentecostal church at the moment, but you just can't beat local church community. It doesn't matter what the denomination is. If it's faithfully preaching the word, meeting each Sunday, there's community happening, worship, people relying on each other, bringing their gifts, serving each other, and being a light in the community, inviting others to come along, being good neighbors, and being good citizens. That's a huge witness. I mean, God's plan A for saving the world is the local church. I really do believe that. And so I think Christians shouldn't underestimate the power of living just as a faithful witness in that regard. Another one I think I've become very reflective on over the last few years in particular is just this need for courage. We're living in a day of cancel culture, and you mentioned earlier about being called all sorts of transphobe, homophobe, all these sorts of things. I was very sensitive to that a few years ago, and I guess really quite worried about the sorts of labels that might be pinned on me. And the further that these debates have moved on, and the sort of more insane and unhinged they've become, the more I've realized, who am I trying to please? Like, I could say the most mild thing and be called a transphobe or a homophobe, and which would mean that I have to just be silent on all things at all times and never say anything controversial, only ever utter a word that's entirely neutral or doesn't relate to any of these topics at all, or that toes the party line. And that's not being a Christian. That's not being salt and light in the culture. And so one of the things I've had to learn is just to suck it up. If people are going to pin labels on me and label me unfairly, so be it. My role, and I would say the church's role, Christians' roles, is not to curate our public image, not to curate the public image of the church. Our role is to be salt and light, to be a faithful witness of Jesus wherever God's called us to be, and whatever that looks like, whatever that means, whatever the topic of the day is. So issues like abortion, are we against the mass slaughter of the unborn? Absolutely, we're against it, and we're not ashamed of that. And we're not going to be told by others that we're that we're insensitive or we don't care or whatever. That is literally the biggest civil rights, human rights issue of today. No competition to that at all. And the idea that standing up for the unborn, that you're somehow a bigot or that you're uncaring is patently absurd. So I've reached a point now on issues like abortion, but there's a lot of other topics, a lot of which we've talked about today, where I actually don't really care what people think of me. And I mean that in a good sense. I don't want to be arrogant. I don't want to be beyond correction. That's the other thing. Once we sort of, I've stepped into this territory now of not caring so much what people think. But the danger there is that we sort of leave humility behind, and we no longer become teachable and able to be corrected. So it is really important that we keep a tender heart towards God, and we have people that we respect, that we're listening to, and that we can respond to advice and criticism from. But in that sense of trying to curate the world's our public image in the world, who cares? Like, seriously, we just got to get over it. And like, be done with cancel culture and instead move into courage culture. There's a cool account on Twitter, absolutely worth a follow, called Courage Culture, and it's just really encouraging that. So I think that's another really big one. And so that's number two. Number three, I would say, is revival. And at the moment, I'm actually researching a book to write on revival with Warwick Marsh, who I work with at the Canberra Declaration. And so we're going to call it Great Southland Revival. I'm hoping to release it in September, and it's essentially looking at the history of revivals from the Book of Acts right up to Australia. So tracing all these different revival movements that have taken place. And I really think the biggest thing that Australia needs and that the world needs is revival. We need a wholesale returning to God, and you can't manufacture that. You can't whip it up. You can't force it, but you can certainly pray for it and you can work for it. And so I think being a faithful witness, having courage, and praying for revival, they're probably some of the most important things that Christians can do to turn the tide on all this kind of craziness.
And what sort of advice, I guess, would you have for people in, building up their courage so that they could, I guess, that they could speak, their minds without worrying about, I guess, any sort of backlash that they might receive or criticism and all that. I mean, obviously none of us are above criticism, and I guess criticism helps us to grow. But what advice would you have for people in building up their courage to be able to, I guess, bring these Christian roots back into the world?
Yeah, a great question again. In some ways, we're all different, and we're all sensitive to different levels of criticism. And for me, I guess I've grown a bit of a thicker skin, and now it's a bit easier for me to step out and be bold. But if you'd asked me to do that 3 or 4 years ago, I would have been a lot more timid. And so it is like, I wouldn't want to sort of thrust someone out, beyond what they feel comfortable with. But perhaps the best piece of advice I could give is, when it comes to these kind of culture war issues, and whether you're talking online or you're talking in person, the principle would be the same. Pick a winning battle. I've unfortunately gone into bat for several things over the last few years, particularly online, where it was never going to be a totally winning battle. Like, I think I probably was still defending the right cause, but it was a bit more nuanced, a bit more grey, and it ended up in these massive long, chat threads where you get nowhere and no one ends up convinced. But here's a great example. We've talked about this question of what is a woman. To me, that is an absolute winning battle. I mean, it can't be more obvious that our culture has kind of gone astray when we can no longer define the word woman. And as believers, absolutely, we have a definition of woman that doesn't depend on cultural factors and hasn't been erased the last 4 years. It's been around for 2,000 plus years. In fact, 6,000 years or whatever, as long as the Bible's been written. God created man in his image, male and female, he created them. So the Bible's definition of man and woman, that is a winning argument. And it's not just Christians that see that, it's anyone who's got a scientific worldview and hasn't collapsed to kind of woke Marxism. So to me, that's an absolute winning battle. I would just say, pick winning battles. Don't pick every battle, pick your battles, but pick the ones that are easy to win. And as you see success and you see, you sort of win that battle, you grow in courage and you realize I can do this again, and I'm encouraging others to do it. And the other one would be surround yourself with people of a like mind. Be careful who your influences are. I mean, I follow a lot of non-Christian people online, and I benefit immensely from what they write and what they do. But sometimes they can be very snarky and not Christ-like. And I need to remember that they don't have Jesus living in them. And, they might be right about what they're posting, but the way they've done it isn't Christ-like. And I fear sometimes perhaps I wander into the same territory. So I need to be careful who my influences are. But yeah, having around you people that are of a like mind and encourage you to be bold and to speak the truth. I can't recommend that highly enough.
For sure. I mean, I definitely agree with that. So I guess in finishing, so thank you for coming on today. It's been a great conversation. So where can people find you if they want to see more of your work?
Yeah, so probably the best place if you just enjoy browsing the news would be the Daily Declaration. I guess most days of the week I publish there. I'm on holiday soon, so I won't be as prolific the next couple of months. But the Daily Declaration, Mercatornet, occasionally the Spectator, the Good Source. There are a couple other places that I'll publish from time to time. My own blog is Cross and Culture. So if you just Google Cross and Culture and even just my first name, Kurt, K-U-R-T, that'll point you in the right direction. I encourage anyone who hasn't read my book yet to pick that up. And I'm on Twitter, I'm on Facebook, all the sorts of usual places. So follow along. I'll follow you back. And it's been fantastic to chat with you, Joel.
Thank you so much. And if you want to find Kurt, I'll put all the links in the description of the video, so you can go and easily find those. Find him, and all the links that for listening to the podcast as well will be in there. Thank you for joining me today, Kurt. It's been a great discussion, and we'll see you next time.
Pleasure. Thanks, Joel.